In the dense jungles of New Guinea during 1943, the skies were ruled by the nimble Japanese Zero. It was a fighter plane that seemed to bend physics, outmaneuvering almost every Allied aircraft it faced. The P-47 Thunderbolt, by contrast, was a massive 15,000-pound airplane that many pilots called a flying bathtub. It was heavily armored, powerful, and equipped with a 2,000-horsepower engine, yet in the tight dogfights over the Pacific Islands, it struggled. Climbing was slow, turning was sluggish, and the lighter, faster Zeros often slipped through its grasp. At high altitudes over Europe, the P-47 had proven itself, but here in the thick tropical air, it was almost a sitting duck. Pilots of the 348th Fighter Group understood the problem firsthand. They would climb desperately to intercept Japanese formations, only to find their Thunderbolts lagging behind. Their propellers, known as toothpicks, were narrow, thin blades designed for high-altitude efficiency. They sliced through thin air with precision at 30,000 feet, but at sea level in New Guinea, the air was thick and humid. The toothpick propellers simply could not grab enough air to lift the heavy plane quickly. Climb rates were slow, dives were shallow, and dogfights that should have ended in Thunderbolt superiority ended in frustration. Colonel Neel Kearby, commander of the 348th, watched his pilots struggle and realized something the engineers seemed to overlook. This wasn't an aerodynamic problem, it was a matter of brute force. The plane had the power, but it wasn't using it efficiently at low altitudes. What was needed was a propeller that could literally shove the air rather than slice it delicately. Kearby understood the dynamics of Pacific combat in a way that textbooks couldn't teach. He envisioned a wider, sturdier blade that would give the P-47 the grip it needed to climb faster and strike harder. When the new Curtiss electric propellers arrived, mechanics in the squadron were skeptical. The blades were wide, flat, and flared at the tips. To them, they looked like someone had bolted canoe paddles onto a fighter plane. Laughter filled the hangars. How could such a crude, ungainly design possibly improve the performance of a plane that already seemed overburdened? The engineers who had designed the toothpick blades had scoffed at anything that didn't follow their calculations. Yet Kearby wasn't swayed by mockery or convention. He saw potential where others saw a joke. The Thunderbolt with the paddle propeller was installed, and Kearby prepared for a test flight. As he taxied onto the runway, mechanics watched with a mixture of disbelief and amusement. They expected a sluggish, awkward takeoff, perhaps another disappointment to add to the Thunderbolt's reputation in the Pacific. But as the plane roared down the runway and lifted into the thick New Guinea air, something extraordinary happened. The climb rate improved dramatically. The massive 15,000-pound fighter, once labored and heavy, now surged upward with unprecedented speed. What had seemed like a joke in the hangar was suddenly a revelation in the sky. The change was immediate and undeniable. In practice maneuvers, Kearby discovered that the Thunderbolt could outclimb and outpace the Japanese Zeros at the altitudes where combat actually occurred. The paddle propeller wasn't elegant or sleek. It didn't slice the air like a scalpel. It grabbed the air, shoved it, and converted raw engine power into vertical acceleration. Suddenly, the Thunderbolt was no longer a sitting target. It was a predator. Pilots who had feared engagement with the Zero could now dive, climb, and attack with a confidence they had never experienced. Kearby's insight changed the mentality of the squadron. Dogfights in New Guinea were no longer battles of attrition, where speed and agility alone decided the outcome. With the paddle propeller, the P-47 could dominate in a style that would come to be called boom and zoom. Pilots would dive from above, use the Thunderbolt's weight and speed to strike, and then climb out of reach before the Zero could respond. What had once been a massive disadvantage was now transformed into a tactical strength. The mechanics who had laughed at the blades were forced to acknowledge the brilliance of Kearby's decision, though quietly. The first missions with the paddle propeller revealed the full extent of its impact. Pilots reported steep climbs, rapid acceleration, and a newfound ability to control engagements. Encounters that previously ended in retreat or stalemate now ended with the Thunderbolt in command. The 348th Fighter Group, once frustrated by the limitations of their aircraft, felt a surge of morale. Here was proof that sometimes the most effective solutions were the ones that looked wrong to everyone else. A simple change, guided by observation and understanding of the real conditions, had turned the P-47 from a struggling bomber interceptor into a machine capable of rewriting dogfighting in the Pacific. By the end of the first chapter of this story, it was clear that the stage was set for a remarkable transformation. Kearby's gamble with the paddle propeller had changed the course of his squadron's operations. The Thunderbolt was no longer just a heavy, clumsy fighter. It was a weapon optimized for the conditions it faced. And in the dense, humid skies of New Guinea, a fighter once mocked for its limitations was poised to dominate the battlefield, one climb, one dive, and one engagement at a time. When the new Curtiss electric paddle propellers arrived at the 348th Fighter Group's base in New Guinea, the reaction from the mechanics was immediate and unrestrained. They gathered around the crates, eyebrows raised, some shaking their heads, others laughing openly. The blades were unlike anything they had ever seen, wide, flat, and flared at the tips. To the trained eyes of these men, who had spent years working on aircraft designed for speed and aerodynamic efficiency, these propellers looked almost absurd. Some muttered that it looked as though someone had taken giant canoe paddles and bolted them onto a 2,000-horsepower fighter. Others joked that the Thunderbolt would probably flap off the runway like a child's toy. The squadron had already been skeptical about solutions to the P-47's problems in the Pacific. Pilots had struggled to gain altitude fast enough, turning was cumbersome, and dogfights against the nimble Zero often ended in frustration or retreat. The so-called toothpick propellers, which were narrow and precise, had worked well at high altitudes in Europe, but here in the humid, low-altitude jungles of New Guinea, they were failing spectacularly. Air was thick, heavy, and resistant. The Thunderbolt's power was there, but it wasn't being used efficiently. Yet the engineers back at home had insisted that their toothpick design was optimal, and any suggestion otherwise was met with polite dismissal. Colonel Neel Kearby, however, was not concerned with polite dismissal. He had observed the combat conditions closely and understood the real problem. The Thunderbolt needed a propeller that could grab the thick tropical air, shoving it rather than slicing delicately. Where the toothpick had failed, he believed the wide, paddle-shaped blades could succeed. He understood the physics, the practical realities of combat, and most importantly, the limitations of relying solely on textbook aerodynamics. To him, the propeller was not ugly, it was powerful, even elegant in its simplicity. Despite Kearby's confidence, the initial laughter was impossible to ignore. Mechanics joked openly in the hangar. "What is this, a ceiling fan for a plane?" one said, earning a chorus of chuckles from his colleagues. Another added, "I've seen boats paddle through water faster than this thing'll climb." The mood was light, but the underlying message was clear. Nobody believed these paddle blades could make a difference. Some senior mechanics shook their heads, muttering about wasted time and effort. To them, it seemed like a reckless experiment at best, or a guaranteed failure at worst. Kearby, however, had learned to ignore doubt when it wasn't backed by observation or experience. He had watched his pilots struggle, seen the failures of the toothpick propellers firsthand, and studied the physics of low-altitude flight in dense tropical air. He knew that the Thunderbolt's engine was capable of incredible power, but that power needed a propeller that could convert it effectively. The paddle design did exactly that. Where others saw a clumsy joke, Kearby saw potential. Where others saw a slow, heavy fighter, he saw a machine that could dominate if given the right tool. Installation of the new propellers was carried out methodically, but with a sense of quiet skepticism from the mechanics. Each blade was heavy, precise, and awkward to handle. There was a palpable tension in the hangar as the final screws were tightened. Some mechanics still exchanged glances, unable to hide their doubts. They whispered to each other about the risks of such a radical change. Would the plane perform at all? Would it even take off? They had seen the Thunderbolt struggle enough to know that optimism alone wouldn't save the day. Kearby didn't try to explain every detail. He didn't argue with the laughter or try to convince anyone that he was right. Instead, he focused on what mattered most, the first test flight. As he taxied down the runway, mechanics lined the edges, some holding their breath, others still chuckling nervously. The Thunderbolt roared to life, its engine vibrating with power, and then lifted into the thick New Guinea sky. Within seconds, it became apparent that this was no ordinary takeoff. The climb rate was unlike anything they had witnessed in a P-47. The plane surged upward with speed that seemed impossible for its size. What had been mocked as an oversized, awkward propeller had transformed the aircraft's performance almost instantly. As Kearby performed his initial maneuvers, mechanics watched in stunned silence. The wide blades, once laughed at, were now proving their worth. They grabbed the dense air, shoved it forcefully, and converted the Thunderbolt's raw engine power into rapid vertical acceleration. Turns were sharper, climbs were faster, and the heavy fighter that had once struggled to match the Zero's agility was now capable of dictating the terms of engagement. The laughter that had filled the hangar minutes earlier was replaced by quiet amazement. Word spread quickly among the squadron. Pilots were eager to fly the Thunderbolt with the new paddle propeller. Reports of rapid climbs, controlled dives, and newfound speed at low altitude filled the air. Mechanics who had once doubted the design began to acknowledge its brilliance, albeit quietly. It was a lesson in innovation and practical wisdom. Sometimes the most effective solution looks wrong to everyone in the room, but the proof is in the results. By the end of those first test flights, it was clear that the 348th Fighter Group was on the verge of a transformation. The Thunderbolt, once derided as clumsy and slow, had been given a new lease on life. Kearby's gamble had paid off, and the stage was set for a dramatic shift in the Pacific Air War. A simple change, a paddle-shaped propeller, had turned doubt into opportunity and laughter into respect. The mechanics who had mocked the design were now witnesses to a quiet revolution, one that would soon make the Thunderbolt the most feared fighter in the skies above New Guinea.
Colonel Neel Kearby knew that theory and hangar success were one thing, but the real test would come in the skies over New Guinea, where the dense jungle air could punish even the most powerful aircraft. The Thunderbolt, now equipped with its strange, wide, paddle-shaped propellers, seemed ready for that test, but skepticism still lingered among the squadron. Mechanics and pilots alike had laughed at the blades, some muttering that they would never make a difference in actual combat. Kearby, however, had no doubts. He had seen the difference in climb rate during practice flights, and he understood the physics that the engineers had overlooked. In thick, humid air, brute force grip mattered more than sleek aerodynamics. On a clear morning in October 1943, Kearby prepared the Thunderbolt for its first serious operational sortie with the new propeller. The engine roared to life, filling the airfield with a vibration that made the ground tremble. Mechanics watched from the hangar, some crossing their arms skeptically, others leaning forward with anticipation. Kearby taxied smoothly, and the massive fighter surged down the runway. As the wheels lifted off, the climb rate was immediate and undeniable. The Thunderbolt, once sluggish and labored, shot upward with power and precision that stunned even those who had been supportive of the new design. Kearby pushed the plane through a series of maneuvers to test its response in conditions that mimicked combat. He executed steep climbs, sharp turns, and rapid dives, noting the way the wide paddle blades grabbed the dense air. Each maneuver felt more confident, more controlled than anything previously experienced in a Thunderbolt at low altitude. The paddle blades did not slice the air, they shoved it, converting the 2,000 horsepower engine into an immediate vertical surge. The heavy fighter that had once struggled to catch nimble Japanese Zeros now had the advantage, and Kearby understood the implications. For the first time, the Thunderbolt could fight on its own terms in Pacific dogfights. The tactical advantage became clear during simulated attacks. Kirby practiced the boom and zoom technique that had long been theorized but rarely executed successfully in the region. With a powerful dive from above, he could strike enemy aircraft with devastating speed, then climb rapidly to safety before the nimble Zeros could respond. The paddle propeller allowed the Thunderbolt to accelerate out of a dive more efficiently and climb faster than any other plane in the vicinity. Where the toothpick blades had failed, the new design gave control, authority, and the ability to dictate the engagement. Word of these test flights spread quickly among the pilots of the 348th Fighter Group. The initial skepticism began to erode as reports came in. Climbs were steeper, dives were controlled, and acceleration at low altitude was unprecedented. Pilots who had once doubted the paddle propeller now wanted to fly the Thunderbolt more than ever. They could see the potential for changing the balance of power in the Pacific. What had been a heavy, awkward fighter was becoming a true predator, capable of controlling the fight in conditions that had previously favored the enemy. Kirby understood that the real measure of success would come not in practice, but in actual combat. The opportunity arrived on October 16, 1943, near Wewak, when intelligence reported a formation of Japanese Zeros operating at lower altitudes than usual. Kirby took off with his squadron, fully aware that this was the moment to validate his gamble. As the Thunderbolt climbed into position, he noted the plane's responsiveness. It felt lighter in the air despite its weight, and each maneuver was executed with precision. The paddle blades were working exactly as he had hoped. When the formation of enemy fighters came into view, Kirby positioned himself above them, using altitude as an advantage. The dense jungle air below seemed to enhance the effect of the paddle propeller, giving the Thunderbolt a sudden burst of climbing power. He dove at 1-0, striking with a combination of speed, weight, and controlled fire. The Japanese fighter stalled as it attempted to follow, and Kirby took it out from above. One by one, he engaged additional Zeros, each encounter demonstrating the superiority granted by the new propeller. Where the toothpick blades had left the P-47 vulnerable, the paddle blades now allowed him to dominate the fight. The effect on the squadron was profound. Pilots who had watched Kirby from the airfield or flown alongside him began to see the practical implications of the paddle propeller. The Thunderbolt could now control altitude, speed, and engagement distance in a way previously thought impossible in New Guinea. Dogfights were no longer purely a test of agility, they were now contests of strategy and power, with the Thunderbolt's climb rate and acceleration offering a decisive advantage. The morale boost among the pilots was significant. A plane that had been mocked as slow and awkward was now capable of taking the fight to the enemy and emerging victorious. Kirby's gamble with the paddle propeller became a case study in innovation under pressure. Engineers and mechanics may have laughed initially, but the results spoke for themselves. The Thunderbolt had been redesigned not in a laboratory, but in the field, based on observation, understanding of conditions, and practical application of physics. By exploiting the capabilities of the wide, flat blades, Kirby turned a perceived weakness into an overwhelming strength. The Pacific skies would never be the same for the 348th Fighter Group. By the end of this chapter, the reality was undeniable. A heavy, clumsy fighter had become a machine optimized for the thick tropical air of New Guinea. The Thunderbolt could now climb, accelerate, and engage enemy aircraft with unprecedented effectiveness. Kirby's vision had been validated, and the paddle propeller had proven itself as a game-changer. In the dense skies above the Pacific Islands, a plane once mocked for its design had become a weapon of fear and precision, setting the stage for Kirby and his squadron to achieve feats that would become legendary in World War II aviation history.
On October 16, 1943, the skies near Wewak became the proving ground for Colonel Neel Kearby and his Thunderbolt. Intelligence had reported a formation of Japanese Zeros operating at lower altitudes than usual, a perfect target for testing the Thunderbolt's new paddle propeller in actual combat. Kearby, fully aware of the risks, prepared his aircraft and squadron for the mission. The heavy P-47, once sluggish in low-altitude fights, now roared with power and promise. As engines screamed across the airfield, mechanics and pilots watched, knowing that this sortie could redefine the Thunderbolt's reputation in the Pacific. Climbing into the thick, humid New Guinea air, Kearby took stock of the formation ahead. The Zeros were nimble and light, historically able to outmaneuver larger fighters. Previous missions had shown that trying to follow them in a P-47 often ended in frustration. But today, with the paddle propeller, Kearby had an edge that the enemy could not anticipate. He positioned himself above the Japanese formation, using altitude as a weapon. From this vantage point, he could dive with devastating speed, strike quickly, then climb away before the Zeros could respond. The first engagement was immediate. Kearby dove at a Zero, feeling the Thunderbolt respond perfectly to his controls. The wide paddle blades gripped the dense air, converting engine power into a vertical surge that allowed him to outpace the enemy. The Zero attempted to follow, but its smaller engine and lack of altitude advantage left it vulnerable. Kearby opened fire from above, and within moments the first Japanese fighter spiraled down, smoke trailing from its fuselage. The squadron watched in awe as the maneuver unfolded. What had once been a slow, awkward fighter now struck with the precision of a predator. Kearby wasted no time. He maneuvered swiftly to target a second Zero, pulling a steep vertical climb that the enemy could not match. The paddle propeller's ability to maintain power and thrust in thick air allowed him to maintain control while climbing aggressively. The Zero stalled, unable to follow, and Kearby fired again, sending the second plane crashing into the jungle canopy below. His situational awareness, combined with the Thunderbolt's newfound performance, allowed him to engage multiple targets without hesitation. The battle intensified as Kearby's squadron joined the fray. Other Thunderbolts, inspired by Kearby's tactics, followed the boom and zoom strategy, diving from above to strike and climbing back to safety. Kearby focused on his own targets, selecting the Zeros that posed the greatest threat. One by one, he engaged the enemy fighters, each encounter demonstrating the lethal combination of power, altitude advantage, and precise piloting. Within a single sortie, he accounted for 6 Japanese aircraft, a feat that had seemed impossible in the Thunderbolt just weeks earlier. The effect on the enemy formation was immediate. Zeros that had once dominated the skies found themselves outpaced and outmaneuvered. They could not climb fast enough to respond to Kearby's attacks, nor could they match the acceleration of the Thunderbolt in the dives. The heavy fighter, previously criticized for its size and lack of agility, had become a machine capable of dictating the terms of combat. Kearby's understanding of the paddle propeller's potential had turned a technological gamble into a tactical revolution. During the engagement, Kearby relied on both instinct and careful calculation. He exploited the Thunderbolt's strengths while avoiding unnecessary risk, using altitude and speed to control the fight. Each maneuver was deliberate: dive, fire, climb, reposition. The paddle propeller allowed rapid transitions between these phases, maintaining engine power and thrust even in the thick tropical air. The result was a fluid, deadly dance in the sky, with Kearby leading the choreography. Reports from his squadron highlighted not only the effectiveness of the aircraft, but also the impact on morale. Pilots who had struggled to compete with Zeros before were now confident. The Thunderbolt could climb faster, accelerate more quickly, and strike from positions previously unreachable. The success of the mission demonstrated that technology, when combined with practical observation, could turn the tide of battle. Kearby's bravery and insight had transformed the fight, proving that one man's gamble with innovation could change the fate of an entire squadron.
By the time the sortie ended, the skies near Wewak were littered with the evidence of the Thunderbolt's newfound dominance. Kearby had personally accounted for 6 Zeros, and his squadron had successfully engaged the remaining enemy fighters. The mission marked a turning point in the Pacific Air War, showcasing how the paddle propeller, once mocked in the hangars, could enable a heavy fighter to outperform its enemies. Mechanics and engineers who had doubted the design were now forced to acknowledge its effectiveness, and the Thunderbolt's reputation soared. The October 16th mission was more than a test of technology. It was a demonstration of innovation, courage, and tactical brilliance. Kearby had taken a machine that many considered flawed and transformed it into a weapon capable of controlling the battlefield. His understanding of aerodynamics, combined with practical observation, allowed him to exploit the paddle propeller's advantages fully. The result was a flight that would be remembered for its audacity and effectiveness, a turning point that cemented Kearby's place in history as a master of boom and zoom tactics. As the Thunderbolts returned to base, the mood among pilots and mechanics alike was electric. Stories of the 6 Zeros and the effectiveness of the paddle propeller spread quickly. The heavy, once-mocked fighter had proven itself not only capable of surviving in the dense Pacific skies, but of dominating them. Kearby's approach combined intelligence, courage, and a willingness to challenge convention, showing that innovation often comes with risk but can yield extraordinary results.
After the extraordinary mission over Wewak, the 348th Fighter Group began to fully understand the long-term impact of the paddle propeller. What had once been a simple, wide, flat blade laughed at by mechanics had now proven itself as a transformational tool in aerial combat. The Thunderbolt, previously criticized for its weight and perceived lack of agility, became a weapon of strategic dominance. Pilots quickly adapted their tactics to exploit the plane's newfound strengths, turning boom and zoom from theory into reality. With each climb, dive, and controlled engagement, the Thunderbolt redefined what was possible in the thick, low-altitude skies of the Pacific. Boom and zoom, a tactic relying on altitude advantage and high-speed dives, was not new in concept. Pilots had understood the theory for years, but execution had always been limited by aircraft performance. In the Pacific, where air was dense and combat occurred at low levels, the Thunderbolt, with its original toothpick propeller, lacked the speed and climb rate to make these attacks effective. Now, with the paddle blades installed, the Thunderbolt could dive from above, strike with devastating force, and climb back out of reach before the enemy could respond. This allowed pilots to engage on their own terms, turning a heavy fighter into a lethal predator. The transformation was not just tactical, but psychological. Pilots who had once feared engaging the nimble Japanese Zeros gained confidence. The Thunderbolt's presence in the skies became a source of intimidation for enemy pilots who had once considered it cumbersome and slow. The combination of firepower, speed, and vertical agility meant that the Thunderbolt could dictate the terms of combat. Japanese formations had to be cautious, altering their flight patterns and tactics in response to the threat posed by these upgraded fighters. The paddle propeller had given the Allied pilots an edge that extended beyond mere numbers or experience. It was a decisive technological advantage. Colonel Kearby's approach demonstrated the importance of understanding conditions over following conventional wisdom. Engineers had designed the toothpick propeller for thin, high-altitude air, believing aerodynamic efficiency was paramount. Kearby, however, recognized the realities of tropical, low-altitude combat, where thick, humid air required brute force grip rather than slicing precision. The paddle propeller did not conform to textbook aesthetics or calculations, but in practice, it allowed the Thunderbolt to perform in ways previously thought impossible. This lesson in practical innovation and field-based problem-solving would become part of Kearby's enduring legacy.
The impact of the paddle propeller extended beyond individual sorties. Squadron-wide training emphasized using altitude advantage and the Thunderbolt's power to control engagements. Pilots developed new strategies around coordinated climbs, dives, and positioning, using the aircraft's acceleration and maneuverability to strike before the enemy could react. Over time, the 348th Fighter Group became a model for effective use of the boom and zoom tactic in the Pacific. The combination of technology, tactics, and pilot skill turned the group into one of the most feared and respected units in the theater. Kearby's success also highlighted the role of risk-taking and decision-making in military innovation. The mechanics who had laughed at the propeller were proven wrong, but it was Kearby's willingness to act on observation and understanding rather than conformity that made the difference. He had identified a problem, proposed an unconventional solution, and demonstrated its effectiveness in real combat conditions. This willingness to challenge assumptions and embrace innovation would inspire both his pilots and future generations of aviators. The legacy of the Thunderbolt with the paddle propeller extended beyond immediate victories. It demonstrated that a seemingly small technological change could have an outsized impact when matched with tactical insight and bold leadership. The aircraft became synonymous with power and resilience in the Pacific skies. Enemy pilots who had once dismissed the Thunderbolt now treated it with caution and respect, aware that its heavy frame, combined with the paddle propeller, could strike decisively and escape unscathed. Even years later, historians and aviation experts would point to the October 16th mission and subsequent sorties as pivotal moments in the Pacific Air War. The paddle propeller, initially mocked, had turned the P-47 from a struggling fighter into a dominant platform. Kearby's strategic use of the Thunderbolt, his understanding of the interaction between technology and combat conditions, and his mastery of boom and zoom tactics became textbook examples of innovation and leadership under pressure. Ultimately, the story of the paddle propeller is a story more than just about aircraft. It is about insight, courage, and the willingness to challenge conventional wisdom. Colonel Neel Kearby saw potential where others saw ridicule, and in doing so, he transformed both his plane and his squadron. The 348th Fighter Group, empowered by technology and inspired by leadership, demonstrated that success in war often comes from the ability to innovate, adapt, and act decisively. The Thunderbolt, once derided as a heavy, awkward fighter, had become a symbol of tactical genius, a plane that could climb, strike, and dominate with precision. By the end of the Pacific campaigns, the Thunderbolt's reputation had been rewritten. The paddle propeller had played a crucial role in that transformation, proving that sometimes the right solution is the one that looks wrong to everyone else. Kearby's vision, combined with the practical application of an unconventional idea, ensured that the P-47 would leave a lasting mark on aviation history. In the skies of New Guinea and across the Pacific, the lessons of innovation, boldness, and tactical mastery would echo long after the last mission, reminding pilots and leaders alike that insight, courage, and decisive action can redefine the rules of the game.